Democracy at home and imperialism abroad. The lead up to American imperialism. American imperialism was different from that of many other nations. Though there were mercantile and economic motivations, American imperialism was usually couched in other terms that spoke of the spread of democracy and of Protestant Christianity. Americans had employed terms such as these almost since the founding of the nation, but those voices and expressions became louder toward the end of the 19th century. Whether the people on the receiving end felt the same way is difficult to say. The argument for intervention. Many Americans believed that the U.S. could and should intervene in the affairs of its Caribbean and Latin American neighbors. To interventionists, it seemed obvious that the peoples of those nations were inept at government and that they needed democratic and moral intervention to become better in that area. Many others argued that the U.S. should expand across the Pacific Ocean, building an empire of islands in that direction. Regardless of whether the target was the Caribbean or the Pacific, a mercantile interest lay beneath the surface. That is, American businesspeople desired new markets and raw materials. American consumers wanted more and better coffee, sugar, bananas, and pineapples, and those island peoples and nations offered the best opportunity. The argument for non-intervention. Many Americans felt precisely the opposite. To them, it was self-evident that the nation was large enough and had more than enough problems of its own. Anti-interventionists generally had the upper hand in terms of U.S. political philosophy because both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had warned the public against the idea of entangling alliances. As the arguments between interventionists and non-interventionists heated up, the voices of professionals and public intellectuals became more important. One of the loudest of those voices belonged to a naval officer who believed that power on the high seas was the single most important factor. The need for stronger navy. Alfred T. Mahan was a naval strategist whose book The Influence of Sea Power on History was published in 1890. Mahan convincingly argued that the most successful nations of modern history succeeded because of their strength at sea, and he used first the Spanish and then the British as examples. Mahan argued cogently that the U.S. needed a stronger navy. The book persuaded the U.S. Navy to start building a new line of steam-powered warships, many of which were just as powerful as their European counterparts. Events that pushed the U.S.'s hand. In 1893, a revolt on the Hawaiian Islands overthrew the legitimate monarchy, headed by Queen Liliuokalani. Many U.S. citizens, merchants and missionaries among them, were in the crowd that toppled the monarchy, and they persuaded the U.S. charge d'affaires. There was no ambassador to call for help from the U.S. Marines. Enough troops were sent that it was obvious the U.S. backed the overthrow and that there would be no restoration of the Hawaiian monarchy. The Queen was forced to abdicate her throne, and the Hawaiian Islands were placed under a protectorate of the U.S. In 1898, at the very start of the Spanish-American War, the American government completed the annexation of Hawaii. In 1894, a revolt broke out on the island of Cuba. The sugar-rich island had been ruled by Spain for nearly 400 years when native-born Cubans started this insurrection. At first, the American policy was one of neutrality. But when it became evident that Spain would use almost any means to quell the revolt, American sympathies turned in the direction of the revolt. This was especially evident when Spain sent 200,000 troops and became one of the first nations to use barbed wire to quarantine and corral prisoners. Barbed wire was an American invention, designed for use on western cattle ranches, but it was now used to establish concentration camps. Yellow journalism. In the 1890s, U.S. newspapers were purchased and read by far more citizens than ever before. Two men led the way in the so-called circulation wars. William Randolph Hearst owned the New York Morning Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer owned the New York World. Both men hoped to break the 1 million mark, to have more than 1 million subscribers. In their efforts at journalistic success, both men overstepped the bounds of their profession. Rather than simply reporting the news, they sought to lead the news, and they did this with special concern for what happened in Cuba. Their competition led to the start of what we call yellow journalism. Yellow journalism means an editorial or journalistic approach that sensationalizes events in order to produce a desired result. The expression may derive from a series of cartoons, often printed in yellow, which highlighted the danger of Asians entering the U.S. But regardless of where the yellow part came from, yellow journalism arrived in the mid-1890s, and it came to stay. Readers of both major New York papers were more inclined than non-readers to support U.S. intervention in Cuba. The Spanish-American War. In 1898, the U.S. sent the battleship USS Maine to Havana on the north side of Cuba. The Maine was intended to observe the volatile situation and to protect the interests of U.S. nationals. At first, there were parties and balls, with courtesies extended between Spanish officials and U.S. Navy officers. But on February 15, 1898, the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, and more than 200 U.S. sailors were killed. Thanks both to the yellow journalism of the previous 3 years and heightened concern about American interests, a majority of U.S. citizens were soon persuaded that Spain had blown up the Maine. Pressure built on President William H. McKinley. McKinley knew something about war. He had been a young major during the Civil War, and the memories of that conflict still haunted him. Left to his own devices, McKinley would almost certainly have kept the nation out of war. But he was pushed by the newspapers, by members of Congress, and even by his own Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy. 39-year-old Theodore Roosevelt had been a boy during the Civil War, and he remembered the parades and celebrations rather than the battlefield casualties. Roosevelt pushed the president to take action. To this day, it remains uncertain that Spain had any hand in the explosion of the USS Maine. The ship may well have exploded from an unattended fire in its boiler room. But the U.S. public made up its own mind, and McKinley was forced, against his better judgment, to ask Congress for a formal declaration of war, which was given in April 1898. The Spanish-American War had begun. The height of irony is that the first major battle was fought not in Cuba or even the Caribbean. On May 1, 1898, a U.S. naval squadron sailed into Manila Bay in the Philippines, half a world away. The short Battle of Manila was an overwhelming U.S. victory, which demonstrated the power of the new steam vessels. With the naval situation of the Philippines under U.S. control, attention then shifted to the Caribbean. The Rough Riders and American victory. Having already triumphed in the Eastern Pacific, the U.S. now turned its attention to Cuba. In June 1898, a large invasion force landed on the southern side of that island. Of the many U.S. invasion groups, by far the most colorful was the Regiment of Rough Riders. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, who resigned his naval post in order to lead the regiment, the Rough Riders were a fascinating combination of East Coast athletes, Ivy League graduates, and Western cowboys. On July 1, 1898, Roosevelt led the Rough Riders in a gallant and successful charge up San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill, both on the outskirts of the Spanish city of Santiago. Overcoming strong Spanish resistance, the Rough Riders reached the top, where many photographs were taken. Those photographs quickly turned Roosevelt into a national hero. 2 days later, the Spanish fleet was completely defeated as it attempted to escape the harbor, and on July 4, 1898, Santiago surrendered, effectively ending the Spanish-American War. The newspapers and magazines made much of the U.S. triumph, going as far as to describe it as a splendid little war. It is true that the U.S. suffered relatively low battle casualties in the Spanish-American War. Far more men died from disease, however, and many of these deaths were attributable to faulty food supplies delivered to the U.S. Army. The peace treaty, signed in December 1898, stripped Spain of the last parts of its once great empire. The U.S. gained control of the Philippines and the island of Guam, as well as Puerto Rico. Some imperialists believe the U.S. should also take Cuba, but that kind of imperialist grab would have contradicted almost every reason for which the war had been fought. Instead, the U.S. enjoyed a quiet but highly effective kind of access to Cuba for decades to come. For the next 40 years, the U.S. Navy maintained a quiet, but nearly constant, presence in the waters surrounding Cuba, making it perfectly clear that whatever government existed on that island owed its existence to the acceptance of the U.S. President McKinley had never been keen on the war, but he was pleased it was over. In 1900, he was practically forced by his fellow Republicans to name Theodore Roosevelt as his vice presidential nominee. McKinley and Roosevelt coasted to victory in the general election of 1900. If all things had remained equal, that would have been the summit of Roosevelt's career. But President McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo, New York, in September 1901, and Roosevelt immediately became the new president of the U.S. The anti-imperialists. A majority of Americans were pleased with what one official called a splendid little war. For a relatively small loss in human life, the U.S. threw Spain out of Cuba and the Philippines. American economic interests were substantially increased by the war. Not all Americans were thrilled, however. Just a year after the war, a small group of leading thinkers and industrialists formed a group which they called the Anti-Imperialist League. Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain, each of whom was recognized as an American leader, both joined the League. They soon encountered commentary from an unexpected source. Rudyard Kipling was a famous British poet. Born and raised in India, he had lived several years in the U.S. In response to the Spanish-American War, he wrote a poem which has been quoted ever since. The White Man's Burden was a classic expression of late 19th century thought. Many people, British, Americans, and others, indeed believed it their burden to civilize and uplift other people around the globe. Today, we find this thinking retrograde and oppressive. To many people of that time, it seemed appropriate. But American resolve was about to be tested. Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. President Roosevelt believed that the nation had to be ready for the big challenges that were just around the corner. He articulated the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, asserting that the U.S. could and would intervene in the Caribbean and South America when necessary. Roosevelt anticipated that the U.S. would need strength in its army, its navy, and the spirit of the populace. Roosevelt's foreign policy is therefore best categorized with this simple statement, which he often quoted: "Speak softly and carry a big stick." The phrase contrasted with his earlier career when he served as police commissioner of New York City. Roosevelt believed in what he called big stick diplomacy. That meant that the strength of the U.S. economy was the leverage he used to influence foreign nations. The concept and its application made Roosevelt quite unpopular with the nations of Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean, but worked rather well during his White House tenure. The most notable use of big stick diplomacy came when Roosevelt pitted two Central American peoples against each other and succeeded in obtaining a lease for the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal. By 1900, the U.S., as well as other nations, desperately wanted a physical shortcut across the American landmass. Steam-powered ships moved much faster than their sail-powered predecessors, but the world economic markets had grown to a point where speed was more important than ever. Roosevelt wanted rights to a narrow section of land in what is now the Republic of Panama. The trouble was that the area was owned by the Republic of Colombia. The U.S. helped the people of Panama carry out a short and successful revolution, and they, in turn, granted the U.S. a 99-year lease on the Isthmus of Panama, the shortest distance across the Americas. The work began during Roosevelt's second term in office. Even though the best engineers were assigned, the task was much more difficult than anticipated. Roosevelt left the White House in March 1909 with the work only two-thirds complete. But when the Panama Canal opened for business in April 1914, it was abundantly clear that the investment was worthwhile. Ships traveled roughly 45 miles in a northeast to southwest direction and suddenly emerged in the Pacific, having saved roughly 8,000 miles of ocean travel. William Taft and the Republican split of 1912. Theodore Roosevelt chose not to run for president in 1908. Even though he remained quite popular, Roosevelt believed he could manage events better from the sidelines. His handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, won first the Republican nomination and then the general election of 1908. Taft seemed like the perfect successor. He backed most of the same policies Roosevelt had, and he was good friends with the outgoing president. But Taft proved more independent than anyone expected. Despite his respect for Roosevelt, Taft carved his own policies, whether in foreign or domestic policy. Taft believed Roosevelt had been correct in his pursuit of the big stick approach to foreign affairs. But Taft developed his own approach, which was largely based on the concept of dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy meant that the U.S. had a special role to play in influencing the other nations of the world, especially the underdeveloped ones. Having served as U.S. Commissioner of the Philippines, Taft believed he was well suited to lead this transformation. Where Roosevelt had used military action or the threat thereof, Taft used persuasive diplomacy, especially regarding the Caribbean islands and the nations of Central and South America. The peoples of those nations did not like Taft any better than they liked Roosevelt, but there were fewer U.S. military interventions in the region. When Taft sought a second term in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt announced he would throw my hat in the ring. In an unprecedented action, a former U.S. president injected himself into the current campaign and sought his party's nomination once more. When it was clear that the Republicans would select Taft, Roosevelt broke from them and declared that the new Bull Moose Party was his path to the White House. The election of 1912. William Howard Taft ran as the traditional Republican Party candidate. He had the unenthusiastic backing of the Republican establishment. Theodore Roosevelt ran as his own nominee, leading the Bull Moose Party, which was constructed almost entirely around his personality. The year 1912 was already established as a year for the political record books. But even the unprecedented events which had transpired in that year were surpassed when a true political outsider won the Democratic Party nomination. This was Woodrow Wilson. Born in Virginia and raised in Georgia, Woodrow Wilson spoke of his new moral diplomacy. Unlike Theodore Roosevelt and William H. Taft, Wilson believed it necessary to instruct Central and South American nations about how to elect good men. Wilson's sincerity was obvious, but today we see him as an interventionist. The three-way election resulted in an easy victory for Woodrow Wilson. He came in first, both in the popular vote and the Electoral College. Theodore Roosevelt came in second, and William Howard Taft had a poor showing, winning only 3 states. Astute political observers noted that an era had come to an end. The Republican Party had dominated national politics since the end of the Civil War, and now it was the Democrats' turn. Wilson's New Freedom. Wilson often spoke over the heads of his followers. However, when he spoke of the new freedom, they perked up their ears. Wilson made a convincing argument that the new freedom meant freeing the individual from constraints. The concept came naturally to a person who had broken the rules and surpassed whatever constraints had been placed upon him. In policy, Wilson's new freedom meant major changes to the political and economic structure. With a Democratic Congress behind him, Wilson led the charge that resulted in the passage of the 16th, 17th, and 18th Amendments. The text of the 16th Amendment is surprisingly simple. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. This one sentence allows Congress and the federal government to lay and collect taxes all on its own, without the slightest concern for the various states or the number of people that live in them. The first federal taxes were quite low. Few people protested them, but the power of the federal government to collect whatever percentage and amount it needed had been thoroughly established. The 17th Amendment was 2 sentences long, but had a greater impact than one might think. The 17th Amendment specified that the U.S. senators would be elected by the voters of those states, not appointed by either the legislature or the governor. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve Act, passed by Congress in 1913, established the Federal Reserve Board. That institution has been the watchdog of the U.S. money supply ever since. Clearly, Wilson's new freedom did not mean a return to the laissez-faire or let-be mentality of previous administrations. Rather, the new freedom intended to make federal institutions so powerful that the individual and family would be forced to become even stronger as a result. One thing about the new freedom was clear. Wilson was, in 1913 and 1914, the most popular president the nation had seen in many years. He seemed destined to lead it into a bright future.